For more on this, I'm joined from London by journalist and broadcaster Juliette Foster. Juliette, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. So the good news, I guess, is that Eurostar services have resumed and the Channel Tunnel is now indeed open. But are things running smoothly again for all those passengers wishing to get away?
Well, let's put it this way. If you were planning to leave London to go to Paris just after 6 o'clock this morning, your train would have been cancelled. So you'll hope that you would have actually picked up a later train to get you there so that at least you can get settled in, you can have some lunch and prepare yourself for the evening celebrations in Paris. But look, the reality is that people's arrangements, they have been disrupted. And this whole business started, in fact, yesterday afternoon. This is when it all kicked off. And yes, in fairness to the company, they did have a backup plan in action, and it did appear to work for a bit, and then it broke down. And then you had all of these build-ups developing along the system. In fact, I was reading about reports that you had trains stuck in tunnels and some of them actually getting out of London and going so far into the journey and then having to go back to where they started. Again, a huge problem for some of the travellers because they thought, well, OK, do we hang around and see if we can find somewhere to stay and then perhaps get on a train the following day, or do we just give up? The other interesting thing about this is that, yes, it has been very disruptive, but there is that saying, one man's meat is another man's poison. So if you happen to be one of the aviation companies, if you happen to be on the cut price carriers like EasyJet or Ryanair, then yes, there is the opportunity to pick up that additional passenger slack. The problem, though, is that they have they themselves only have a certain amount of capacity to take this. And of course, the difficulty when something like this arises is that fares do go up. And in fact, I checked the Eurostar site, in fact, for these journeys from London to Paris. And I actually found that on one of the later trains, the fare was over £300. I read somewhere else, in fact, on one of the other reports from a transport reporter writing in about this, that the cheapest flight which they found on one of the national carriers here, leaving London to fly to Paris, was about £600. So this really has been disruptive in more ways than one, because yes, some people have found that they're perhaps getting to Paris or Amsterdam a little bit later than what they intended. So yes, they will get some of their New Year celebrations, but it's also the inconvenience as well. You don't want to travel in a way that's hurried and where you can't really settle into the journey and then just relax for the rest of the day. It's the worry. Am I going to get on that next train? Will I get a seat? How much extra is it going to cost me? So yes, services are moving. When will they get back to normal? Well, that could be, who knows, perhaps over the end of the day, perhaps over the weekend when things really do settle back down. But again, it is a bit embarrassing and very exasperating if you're one of those travellers who was caught in this.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, it's that not knowing what's going to come next. And of course, you know, we can't forget that this is one of the busiest travel weeks of the year. Passengers were stranded on Eurostar trains overnight, as you did say, in all different places, on the tracks, in the tunnels. It was very difficult for people to get from place to place. What caused this widespread disruption? Do we have any more details on what went so wrong?
Well, what we heard was that there was an incident, a power outage. And again, the question is, well, how did it happen? I am not going to be conspiratorial about this, but I mean, I do have a thing about transport in the sense that when something goes wrong, obviously we want to know why, but you can't just settle for, something went down here on the cables, whatever, and we've restored it. Yes, the engineers did come out all night and they'll put in some good claims for overtime, let me tell you that, given the time of year as well. But there clearly was some sort of a power outage. The question is, what happened? What caused it? OK, how can we prevent it from occurring in the future? OK, now, in fairness to Eurostar, it did have a backup plan to lean into. It did lean into it, and it worked up to a point. It also involved the shuttle end of things. Okay, so this is the line which carries the cars and the trains, the freight, basically, the cars and the freight. And then there was a breakdown there, so then you had a backup for the cars wanting to get into Calais, being stranded at Folkestone, and so on and so forth. So clearly, the trigger to all of this does appear to have been that power outage. Now, they will need to work out why. Why did it happen? who is going to take responsibility for that? Because Eurotunnel, as I understand it, they said, hang on a minute, that's not our fault. But I think people get very, very sensitive when things like this happen, when you attribute it to a failure somewhere, a mechanical failure somewhere in the system. Is it just simply that there was too much capacity and it couldn't perhaps cope and it took things beyond their normal limits? Or some people might turn around and say, well, maybe there's some sort of sabotage that was going on. I'm not suggesting that for the moment. What I am saying is that when a transport system works reasonably well, okay, and it copes at times when it is tested, like now, the Christmas New Year break, and something goes wrong, okay, you have to think about all sorts of possibilities, okay, and you have to ask yourself, well, was there some malicious intent on this, simply to test the system to see what damage we could inflict? Now, it's not as far-fetched as it sounds, because we have had episodes in other parts of Europe, for example, also in the UK, where transport systems have been attacked. So you have to think about this, okay? So once upon a time, when the world perhaps wasn't in the place where it is now, you could just simply take an explanation at face value. That's not quite the case. But either which way, it has certainly disrupted systems. They need to find out what happened, okay, so that it doesn't repeat itself, because we know that there are certain times in the year when the usage will be very heavy. Christmas is one. If you have long bank holiday weekends, that's another. Also Easter, okay? So people will want to go away. So you have to make sure this doesn't happen, because the good thing, the merciful thing, is that it doesn't happen all the time. But when it does occur, it leaves a very sour taste in the mouth of the users. And they're not going to be happy, because remember, the Eurostar fares, they've gone up. Your average traveller who uses it, he or she is a captive audience. Why? Because there isn't a rival to it, okay? If you're going to use an alternative, you get the plane. But if you don't want to use the plane and you'd like to travel to Paris or to Amsterdam or to Brussels by train, okay, what rival is there to the Eurostar? There isn't one, not really.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Juliette Foster, I've gone on the Eurostar many times. I am telling you, there's no rival to it unless you get on a plane. But thank you so much for joining us. And of course, Happy New Year's to you.
And a Happy New Year to you too. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure.